Welcome back to Tech Talks. Thank you so much for joining us. And today we've got two very special speakers. Carol Piovesan, she's the co-founder and managing partner of INQ Law, and she's a lawyer who practices privacy, cyber, and AI law. And we've got Ira Pargi. She's a partner at INQ Law, and she practices information and health law. Welcome to Tech Talks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to get right into it. Tell us about INQ Law and why there's the focus on AI at INQ Law.
Sure. Thank you so much for having us on this program. It's a real pleasure. So INQ Law is a law firm that really tries to focus in specific areas where we see a lot of need for our clients. We have a very strong and historic health practice where we support a number of particularly Ontario organizations in the area of health law, and IRA is one of our leads on that. We also have a very strong privacy and data protection practice. In fact, we were recognized by the Globe and Mail 2 years in a row as one of Canada's top firms on cyber and data protection. So we're very proud of that recognition. And then we also have a strong focus on corporate commercial law. We practice primarily in Ontario, but in select jurisdictions outside of Ontario. We also have a consulting firm that is a separate entity, but that does enable us to do more in the specific areas of privacy, cyber readiness, data governance, and then AI governance.
And what does AI governance mean in this context?
So when we talk about AI governance, we are talking about the governance processes that are being put in place, particularly to protect against high-risk AI systems. And when I'm saying high-risk AI systems, I mean the use case of that technology. So we want to use artificial intelligence in the context of employment or recruitment, for instance. Well, that likely constitutes a high-risk use case. And so we want to have some governance. We want to have some controls in place to make sure that these systems are not unintentionally or inadvertently perpetuating discrimination against certain groups, to make sure that the systems are operating in a manner that's fair and that's appropriate for the intended use case.
Right. And in that case, seeing lots of stories about AI is perpetuating discriminatory stereotypes in just the way it's operating. So what would the role of INQ Law be in this regulation and trying to mitigate that?
In this case, we may be providing advice on data inputs, the authority to actually use the data for the purposes of algorithmic training. We might be advising on some of the security elements from a legal perspective. We may be advising on the potential liability associated with the system. And then we could certainly provide advice on what are some of the best practices that we're seeing to mitigate enterprise risk associated with the use of those systems.
One of the things that we work a lot with our clients on is data input. So AI is always trained on large data sets, and the provenance of those data sets can be a really important consideration. Traditionally, a lot of large data sets, certainly those derived from clinical trials, for example, they tend to rely on information from a certain population. And typically that's been a largely white population. An example, the Framingham Heart Study, which is a famous longitudinal study in the healthcare field, we've found now that its data really relies on a white patient population. Its results empirically were not as helpful for African Americans. Those same challenges translate over even much more so in the AI world. So one of the things we help clients do is figure out how to get good data sets that they can use to train their tools to really work the way they want them to. And in a world where we're now talking, for instance, about equity in healthcare, it's a concern that really became top of mind during the pandemic. That's a very important consideration for folks, is making sure that their AI tools are actually going to work across populations and groups.
That's really important work. Is that part of what you're doing?
That's part of it, and at least helping to make sure there are systems in place to be asking the right questions. It's tough, frankly, in many settings to get ideal data sets, and that's just something folks need to be aware of as they go into it. For instance, in the healthcare setting, you may not get an ideal data set, then you at least need to understand what its limitations are and which patient populations may be underserved or misserved by certain tools that are derived from problematic data sets.
The work that you're doing, because you're on the ground now, you're helping guide these companies in their use of AI to mitigate any challenges or harms that come up. So the government's looking at Bill C-27. There's a component of it called the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, but really it's just a framework for we need to start consulting on this. Will the work that you're doing and the best practices that you're uncovering, are they going to inform the development of that component of Bill C-27?
Yeah. So when I look at Part 3 of Bill C-27 that you're referring to, what it really does for me is it highlights a few things. That there will be some oversight required for high impact systems, which means you need to understand what is a high impact system, how you're going to evaluate your systems. And again, we're not talking technically, we're talking about the system in the context of a use case, right? So you're going to look at the use case and how AI is used in that example.
Okay. Can you give an example of a high impact?
Absolutely. For instance, in the example that Ira gave, classic example of high impact. You're using artificial intelligence to solve a business problem where the downstream implications can be particularly harmful to individuals. The example I gave earlier of, the use of AI in employment. Well, we saw the Amazon example years ago when they were looking to use artificial intelligence to help identify who some of their senior executives ought to be. It favored white males over others because that's what the historic data was showing. And so we don't want to be perpetuating this bias into the future, but that's what our historic data looks like. And so we have to be mindful of these use cases and how we're going to put in place controls is to mitigate risk and reduce harm.
Now, it seems like the state is at least a partial step ahead of us. Department of Commerce, the National Institute for Standards and Technology, they just released an artificial intelligence risk management framework. I saw on your website that Inc. is looking at that. Give me some feedback on that framework. Is it on the road to completion? Is it a tool that's useful? Is it providing some guidance for the industry?
Sure. The NIST AI risk management framework was released in January 2023, and it's a voluntary guide to be used by companies or organizations looking to adopt artificial intelligence. It is intended to be a menu of options, not a framework that you plug and play. They've done lots of consultations, came back and said, here's what we think are some of the considerations you should bake into your own AI risk management framework. Now, Canada, the US, we have been collaborating a lot in terms of standards for artificial intelligence. While the US might be a little bit further ahead on its risk management framework, Canada is further ahead in terms of regulating high impact AI systems. So we're taking different approaches in how we decide to put up effective guardrails, but I wouldn't say that one jurisdiction is necessarily barreling forward where the other is lagging behind. In fact, Canada was the first country to come forward in 2017 with a national strategy on AI. We have been leaders in AI ethics, working with the French initially to set up the Global Partnership on AI. We've had quite a bit of investment in artificial intelligence, both from a commercialization and a research and development perspective. Plus, we're quite active on the standards scene. So I think we've done a lot as a country to be proud of. What I would love to see is that we come out a lot stronger on commercialization and protecting our intellectual property.
That leads into another question I have. I'm a bit of a nationalist. We've had Canadian companies that became global leaders in the tech field and then got squeezed out. How do we maintain the health of our tech ecosystem in Ontario? Because it is the fastest growing tech ecosystem in North America. We're not as big as Silicon Valley, obviously, but we're growing quickly. At the same time, how do we keep it in-house? How do we make sure that the value that's developed in Canada actually stays in Canada, or at least a portion of it, and we maintain our head offices here?
There are many who will say we need a much more robust and a much stronger IP strategy. Provincially, nationally, we need to be much stronger at encouraging the protection of our intellectual property, and that Canadian innovators need to be much stronger on patenting their innovation. The US and China are much more aggressive in terms of patenting than we are. They will argue serves as a major disadvantage. The other thing that we are doing is trying to attract a lot of talent to Canada, trying to make it easier for talent to enter the Canadian market, although we're hearing about some of the downstream effects of that, particularly from a housing perspective. So we need to make sure we have an integrated strategy, but then really promoting Canadian talent and Canadian expertise and our businesses around the world much more effectively. and giving that international marketplace. The other thing that we advocate for is to harmonize Canadian standards where it makes sense to do so. We don't need a made in Canada approach for absolutely everything. We already have a fragmented data space when you look at the law for personal information. We need to be really conscious of how we create a framework that is functional for AI risk management, and that's global. We don't want our companies ultimately to be disadvantaged because our market is much more difficult to comply with than other key jurisdictions around the world. So we're very mindful of that. The federal government, at least from what I have seen, is very conscious of that as well.
One of the benefits Canada has is that although things are a patchwork in terms of regulation, they are less of a patchwork than in the US. Many privacy and other technology-related laws, including AI laws in the US, are being enacted at the state level, which is excellent, but it's at the state level, and there are a number of states. And so one of my hopes for Canada is that we can figure out, as Carol says, to think about smart ways to harmonize upward to global standards where that is appropriate, and to think about smart ways to make Canadian frameworks federal where possible. There are some movements towards that. The amendments to PIPEDA, the federal privacy law, actually talk about automated decision-making, which is often AI-driven. Those amendments talk about transparency and telling people when their information is being used for automated decision making. And that's an example of an important federal regulatory step towards transparency and trust in the world of AI use.
Such a healthy conversation. The more conversations I have around AI, the more I realize just how rapidly emerging this field is. And we've been talking a lot about kinds of regulations that are going to be needed. Like we need some guidelines for people, and that's global needed. I want to ask you also about what opportunities are you seeing in transformative opportunities are you seeing from AI? And
there are a lot of interesting uses of AI to do things where there's either more room for human error or it's just very labor intensive. And it's worth thinking about at a time when healthcare workers are burnt out, hospitals are understaffed. There are tools that can help healthcare workers identify if a particular patient is at risk of an adverse event or a medical deterioration. There are tools that can sort of monitor the patient and sort of say to a nurse, here's a patient you should check up on soon. That's a very specific example. In a world where there are finite resources and exhausted workers, I think there are some great opportunities.
Fantastic.
We are seeing the use of AI in everything to help develop marketing materials, to support call centers. It's an analysis of your speech patterns and your voice to determine if you're effectively communicating in a call center capability, better triaging of different resources needed depending on the industry. There is not a sector that isn't touched. And you can be looking at AI uses both internally for internal efficiencies, productivity gains, as well as identifying new markets and really asserting a competitive advantage in your area. So really, let Canadians go forward and adopt this technology. We are traditionally a little slower on adoption. We want to get to adopting. That actually helps our businesses more than anything if we can start to adopt Canadian innovation, but then do so responsibly. Recognize we already have good guidance in terms of what we need to be setting up for our internal AI governance programs, and we can start to do that now, and we should. So I'm a really big advocate of both the go innovate and use the innovation, but let's talk about how to do it responsibly.
This leads into my final question. We've got this quickly growing tech ecosystem in Ontario. How do we maintain it? If you could ask the government to do a couple of things that would maintain the growth of our tech ecosystem, what would it be?
One of the principles that gets talked a lot about when we talk about AI deployment is this idea of explainability and trust. So you need to be able to explain how an AI technology works so that people want to use it, and so that they trust its use and its outcomes. It sounds a little bit silly, but it's actually essential. So in a healthcare context, for example, a physician will not want to use a tool if they don't understand how the tool supports clinical decision-making. And a patient is not going to trust the tool either. One of the big things governments can do is help to make sure that those principles of explainability get captured in a regulatory way. It's an essential discussion that has to happen before these tools get used. That's the only way anyone will use them. And it's the only way that people are going to trust these things to actually help them and make their lives better.
It's really interesting, and it's an answer I hadn't anticipated at all. Helping people to adopt the technology. We need Canadians to use and adopt the Canadian innovation, so we have a local market.
Let's see the Ontario government adopting technology and talking about how it's doing so responsibly. Let's see incentives to adopt technology. That's the best way, that in a responsible manner. So I think the narrative has to be strong in that respect, but that's probably the best way we're going to elevate our own ecosystem.
This is such a rich conversation. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Ira.
Thank you for having us.
Absolutely. Thanks.
Thank you for watching. Don't forget to follow me on social media, and we'll see you next week for more Tech Talks.